All right, it's 6:01. We'll go ahead and get rolling on the conversation. First of all, thank you all very much for attending our webinar Q&A tonight, discussing the Yorba Linda resident-driven housing element. My name is Ryder Todd Smith. I consult with the city on the community outreach component of this effort to make sure we are casting the net far and wide to seek active community feedback on this very important issue, something that I know for certain is near and dear to the residents of Yorba Linda. My role tonight is to MC this call, field questions, and really tee the questions up to give them to Nate and David so we can move through them efficiently and try to get out as much information as possible this evening to help the public know what is up and what's going on. So that's the mission for tonight. I want to just note a couple of things. First, we're going to go through some quick panelist introductions. We have a presentation that I'm hoping is going to take 20 to 25 minutes. For those of you that saw a presentation at the city council meeting when they received the working group's report, it's going to be some similar content, but our goal is to baseline everybody with a similar knowledge about what's going on with the housing element. And then we'll jump into Q&A. We are scheduled to go till 8 o'clock tonight, and then we're going to have to bring it to a close because some of our panelists need to get off to some other appointments they have this evening. I also just want to note this is being recorded, and that's really on purpose. This is a great studio setup for us, and our goal is to get this recorded so it becomes an educational asset as part of our strategic outreach strategy to make sure we're getting everybody out there in the community. So we'll get this recorded tonight. It'll be up on yllocalcontrol.com. You'll see that URL throughout the slide deck this evening. This is a new dedicated website the city has launched related to the housing element process and ensuring access to lots of information to aid the community understanding the housing element process. So real quick, let me have my two panelists introduce themselves. David, you want to quickly just tell us who you are, what you do at the city, how long you've been doing planning work?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Brantley. I am the city's Community Development Director, and I've been working for the city actually twice since I started in 1996, left for a couple of years in 2000 timeframe, came back and have been here since. Been working with Nate on the housing element this particular cycle for the last couple of years since 2020, 2021 timeframe.
Great. And then Nate, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Nate Farnsworth. I'm the city's planning manager. I've been the key project manager related to the housing element. I've been working in the city since 2016. Prior to that, I've spent most of my planning career in Orange County. This is my third housing element cycle that I've been through as a lead project manager in going through the housing element process. So that's who I am.
Awesome. Well, your nickname became Nate the Great throughout our process so far, so I'll try to resist using that too often. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, first, another reminder that we are going to be recording tonight. And like I said, we're going to get to Q&A a little bit later. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen where you can submit questions. I already see one's been submitted. It says Q&A on it. That's how you can submit your questions to us tonight, and we'll be trying to get through those. I also just want to remind everybody, and I'll say this a little bit later in the evening too, we had it open for the last several days to be able to submit questions. So we actually have a bunch of pre-submitted questions that are already in the pipeline for us. And so we're going to get started with some of those this evening as well. So I want to thank a bunch of members of the community who pre-submitted some questions. So this slide is an important one because I really feel like when we have community conversations, and so much in our society these days, we struggle to make sure we all agree upon some facts in conversation. So what I want to just make sure is we all get agreement on certain facts that are really, frankly, were facts that our working group that we assembled, and you hear more about them in a bit. But these were facts that we were all operating under as we put together the housing element plan that the residents devised in this working group, and we're now presenting as a draft concept and coming to you, the fellow residents of Yorba Linda, to discuss. So number one, basic fact that the RHNA housing allocation, that stands for Resident Housing Needs Assessment process, and we can get into the nerdy details about that, basically says the city has to plan for 2,415 housing units, and then what's called the sixth cycle, or units to be developed between the year 2021 and 2029. There's a whole labyrinth of process of how that gets allocated, and we have a couple questions that came on that, so we'll get into details about that a bit later. Second fact is that cities that don't have a certified housing element can face very negative impacts, such as loss of state funding, loss of local control, and risk of builders' remedy claims as well. And so really getting a certified housing element is a big defense against all those issues. And those are real issues. Those are real concerns. Number three, that while in 2022, the city had a chance to vote on this and decided to vote no on the housing element as presented then, 2024 represents the last opportunity to actually adopt a certified housing element and then implement that zoning through your voter choice measure there, measure B. And that if we fail to do that, we will actually lose what is currently our conditionally certified housing element. And then once we lose that, then the barn doors open and a bunch of other negative consequences can manifest. Fourth item is that generally the legal pathways toward battling against housing laws, state mandates, and the RHNA housing allocation are all highly likely to fail or are challenged. So far, we've seen some rebuff on lawsuits the city's been involved with. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And it seems pretty clear from most policy experts we speak to that there's not a white knight coming in to rescue us on these issues before November of 2024. So it's kind of 2024 or bust in terms of adopting a housing element. And then last but not least, to that point, that the citizen statewide ballot measure to restore local control are currently long shots. And it's not even clear if adopted that they would actually address, indeed probably would not address, the RHNA housing allocation for the city. So kind of these facts all were discussed extensively with our working group residents, and we've discussed it with legal counsel. And these are the operating facts that we have tonight. We'll be presenting these same facts in our workshops when we go about across town to visit with folks, and happy to have conversations about those as well. But these are operating facts that we're trying to move forward with so we can make good choices and help empower you with good decision-making framework for options. All right, we'll go to the next slide. And with that, I want to hand it off to David because I want him to take a few moments to explain housing elements and then move through some other items. David?
Oh, thank you, Ryder. So what is this thing called the housing element anyways? What does it do? Who requires it? It's part of city's general plan. State law requires all cities to have a general plan. It consists of what are called 7 elements. One of those elements is the housing element, and it's basically a housing plan that is required to meet the state's housing mandate. Every 8 years, the state issues essentially a quota to all communities in the state of California, requiring them to produce or provide the capacity to produce, more specifically, a certain number of housing units. The state agency that administers housing mandates on behalf of the legislature is the Housing and Community Development Department, or HCD. How many units does Yorba Linda has Yorba Linda? How many cycles has Yorba Linda adopted? Well, housing element law came into effect in the 60s. So there's been 6, we're in the 6th cycle right now. And so my guess is that Yorba Linda has been involved in probably 5 of the 6 cycles that have occurred to date thus far. What is different about this cycle compared to last cycles? Well, I've worked on a couple of cycles here in Yorba Linda, the 4th and the 5th cycle, and the 4th and 5th cycles were much lower levels of units. I think we had around maybe 1,800 units in the 4th cycle, and then in the 5th cycle we had 669 units. How did we get our housing unit allocation?
And so I guess just to your point, so 669 last cycle roughly, and now we're at 2,415 in this cycle. So it's
correct.
Been a 4x
so
increase.
Huge difference, and Yorba Linda is not unique. in terms of the difference between the RENA number that we're working with this cycle versus prior cycles across the county and across the entire Southern California, what's known as the SCAG region. The story is pretty much the same, and it really derives from the fact that the state issued to the SCAG region a very high, what's called the regional RENA number, which was 1.34 million units for the sixth cycle. So how did we get our housing unit allocation? Well, HCD issues the regional RENA number, which is again the 1.34 million housing units. And then our regional planning entity called the Southern California Association of Governments, which is a metropolitan planning agency. They are charged with the responsibility for determining how that 1.34 million units is allocated to the individual jurisdictions within the SCAG region. So, and they come up with a formula that's very complex, and I think Nate's going to touch a little bit on that later in the presentation. And essentially, you know, the RENA process is intended to provide housing capacity to meet what the state has determined as the number of units that are necessary to further the state's interest in providing housing of all income levels. And it's not the only type of housing that is built in cities. In fact, the RENA number itself is composed of actually 4 different levels of housing: low and very low income level, then moderate income level, and then finally above moderate, or what is also called market rate housing. So apart from the RENA, there's other housing that gets built in communities by private developers, which is, again, is market rate housing. Next slide. So I think, Ryder, you touched on the fact that, you know, some of the ideas that have been kind of floating around housing policy the last year or so is this idea of maybe fighting the state and pushing back against these housing mandates. And the city certainly is involved in pushing back to the extent that we're able to. And we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of that. But the idea of just sitting on our hands and doing nothing while some of these other efforts play out is very risky. So what our approach has been, and what the city council's thought has been on this, is to work in parallel with some of these efforts to challenge some of these housing mandates, but also plan for the worst. And so we're doing both. We are, you know, working towards complying with the law, while at the same time participating in some of these legal challenge efforts and other efforts to try to affect changes in the current housing policy situation in the state. Next slide. So after the failure of Measure Z, which was the ballot measure last election in November of 2022, it became pretty clear that the city needed to do more outreach and connect in a better way with our residents as it relates to trying to figure out a path to possibly creating a new housing element or making revisions to the prior housing element effort that would be more palatable to the community and hopefully could help us retain our conditional certification. So Last June, we invited a group of residents from across the city to join us in a conversation about housing policy in the city. It was made up of 17 residents who had previously plugged into the whole housing issue and were interested in it and had ongoing interest in wanting to try to help create a better plan. So again, those were selected from, across the city so that all areas, all geographic areas of the city were represented.
Yeah, and I think to that point, David, we actually have a map. If you want to go to the next slide, we can go ahead and move to the next slide too. So
Yeah,
these are
so actually here's the folks that participated in our working group, and the map shows where their home is. As you can see, it's pretty diversely dispersed across the entirety of the city so that all interests were represented. Go back to the previous slide.
Actually, we can keep moving forward, David. I want to make sure we keep moving. So
Okay,
fundamentally, that's just a roster of all the content for the report, which is available on ylocalcontrol.com.
got it.
Keep
Okay,
going.
next slide then. So why pursue a certified housing element? So certification, as Ryder mentioned, provides a defense against a lot of things that can happen to cities that fall out of compliance. These include fines against the city, which can amount to as much as $600,000 a month, which is a significant number, $7.2 million per year. Just for context, that's enough money to fund, I think we said 23 sheriff's deputies.
Yeah.
It's a huge number. You also can lose local control. The state can take over your permitting process, and they can dictate where housing is going to go. And one of the concerns is that the first place they're going to look probably isn't going to be far from the sites that have already been identified. I mean, Yorba Linda is almost a built-out community. There are not a ton of sites. So the thought is that a lot of the same sites that had already been considered by the community in the previous and current housing element efforts would likely become sites if we were to lose local control. Builder's remedy, that is a law that is part of sort of this morass of housing laws in California. And what it basically says is that for cities that do not have a certified housing element, a builder can come into the community and basically dictate to the community where and what they want to build, irrespective of the zoning or general plan land use designations of the property, as long as they provide at least 20% of the units within their project as affordable to lower income persons, or 100% of the units affordable to moderate income persons. And we're going to talk a little bit about those income levels later on as well. And then other potential things that can happen, you can lose state grant money, which pay for our roadways, our contribution to homeless sheltering services in Placentia and in Buena Park and Anaheim. We're part of a coalition of North Orange County cities that basically provides a lot of services for homeless people. It allows us to enforce our anti-vagrancy laws in the city and anti-camping within public rights of way laws. So a lot of sanctions that can occur. There also are lawsuits that can be filed by housing advocacy groups. There are numerous yes in my backyard type groups in the state that their mission is to ensure that housing is available for all Californians in each community. So next slide, please. So again, the lead up to the working group I mentioned a moment ago, really it was Measure Z failed by 75%. I think the community spoke loud and clear that they were not happy with the city's initial stab at a housing element. And again, we needed to involve residents directly in coming up with a housing element 2.0 that hopefully would be more palatable to the community and would address the concerns that were evident in the previous go around. Next slide. So after working with the working group, we did achieve consensus. I won't say that it was, with a lot of alacrity or celebration. I think it was really tough. Not honestly, most people in Yorba Linda really love the community the way that it is, and they don't necessarily embrace the idea of expanding housing production in the city. However, in light of all of the issues that we're discussing this evening, they understand that it's state law and that the sort of lesser of evils is to try to maintain a certified housing element to insulate the city from a lot of the sanctions that I mentioned earlier. So no one was super excited about it though. But it was something that they felt was a better plan and addressed a number of the concerns and balanced out the number of units across the geography of the city in order to really address one of the major concerns that we heard, which was there were more units that were on the west side of town in the original plan. Next slide. So the working group also came up with some guiding principles for where to put housing in general, and the idea of really protecting our single family neighborhoods was very much one of the planning principles that they encouraged. They also encouraged preservation of open space and greenfield development over infill. They also wanted the city to be very mindful of fire hazard severity zones. A lot of these are on the city's east side of town and north boundary, as you know, where urbanized area meets the wildland. At these margins, that's where we've had serious wildfires over the years, and making sure that we are very mindful of developing new housing within those areas and ensuring that we have considered evacuation routes and ability to evacuate, as well as other issues that can help mitigate the hazard from fire. Again, wherever reasonably possible, zoning should avoid putting high density next to single family. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about some of the ideas for revising the plan later on. Next slide. Just a couple more of the planning principles. The idea of reducing building heights when adjacent to single family, having greater setbacks, ensuring that we have design standards that will foster high quality appearance with our architectural design, that we try to use or create mixed use areas wherever it's economically appropriate. And the idea of doing that in Savvy Ranch came through really very prominently. Mixed use is often an idea that can be employed in areas that are somewhat declining, commercial areas that are declining. if you can introduce housing, it provides kind of a natural customer base for retail. So that idea was supported by the working group. And then the idea of ensuring that our parks and trail systems and recreation and open space areas are preserved, and that we try to expand those as they occur in our general plan and apply them wherever possible. Next slide.
So David, I'll take it from here.
Okay.
So the working group came up with basically 6 key suggestions for the city council and for the community even to consider. You can see them here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but the key ones is that the working group did recommend that retaining local control through a 2024 ballot measure is far more important than losing local control through some of these penalties that the state has in place. And recommendation that the city needs to utilize more tools to inform residents and provide them with information to understand the issues here. The working group also recommended that the city conduct a scientific survey to better understand public sentiment, and the city is working with a firm, FM3, to assist in this effort. And then finally, David, mentioned the importance of mixed use concepts, and the working group did recommend that, and especially recommended focusing on the Savvy Ranch area as a potential new downtown-like area for Yorba Linda. Let's go to the next slide. So where we started, basically we took the plan that was approved by the city council in 2022, the one that appeared before the voters, which was conditionally certified by the state. And we worked from that plan. The council had removed 4 sites from the housing element prior to Measure Z. And the working group took that housing element and worked with that to come up with what we're essentially calling Housing Element 2.0. Let's go to the next slide. I'd like to walk through some of the specific changes that are here. This slide here just summarizes the working group's recommendations. I'm going to use the maps that are on the next couple slides to walk through a visual representation of exactly what changes are proposed. But essentially it consisted of removing certain sites, reducing the proposed density on certain sites, and adding some sites that seem to be more of interest to the public. So let's go to the next one and I'll talk through that. So the model plan here, this is going to be broken up into 3 different sections of the city that you'll see. So let's start with the first one on the next slide, which is, these are the east side changes that were proposed. You can see from the map here, this site right here, the city council, this is the site at Meadowland, Camino de Bryant. Council did recommend removing that. The working group said, let's keep that off as well. Everything else, the other changes that are proposed here was the recommendation to add a new 8-acre site in Savvy Ranch that would allow for densities up to 60 units to the acre. And also a recommendation to reduce the density at the Bryant Ranch Center from 35 units to 10 units to the acre. And that 10 unit to the acre zoning, I should point out, is limited in 2 stories in height. So this resulted in a 70% reduction on the Bryant Ranch Center site, which was one of the real contentious areas that was raised during the public outreach process during the last Measure Z process. This does result in a significant increase in the Savvy Ranch area, but we did hear from a number of working group members, as well as during the public hearing process, that there was an interest in utilizing Savvy Ranch to help solve this housing situation that we've got. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about the central changes that were proposed. Again, there are 3 sites, although they appear as more like 2 sites on here, that the council removed, and the working group recommended keeping those off as well. This is
to
a
be
site.
clear, Dave, Nate, excuse me, when you're talking about sites removed, are you referring to the little red outline areas?
Yeah, so the red outlined areas are sites that have been recommended for removal, to not be included, that had at one point been included as a recommended site. So the working group has recommended removing these red sites. So this is at the southern terminus of Ohio. I know we don't have street names on here. This is a small parcel at the intersection of Kellogg and Grandview. That site was recommended to be pulled out. And then within the central area as well, the Chabad Center off of Yorba Linda Boulevard, that had been identified as a congregational land site. And that was recommended for removal as well. One of the big key areas that I would like to point out, the Fairmont site, which is a vacant parcel, 23-acre parcel up off of Fairmont. There was a recommendation to reduce the acreage, the developable acreage of that site from 23 acres down to 3 acres, which is a reduction of 230 units to 30 units. I know that was a hotbed site, no pun intended. That resulted in a reduction of 85% of the units that were proposed for the Fairmont site. That site at the 10 unit to the acre density would also only allow for 2-story units to be built there. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about the changes proposed on the west side. West side definitely had the larger number of sites that were proposed originally, and that was one of the concerns of the working group was, digging into a little bit of a fairness factor. And you can see the red sites that are proposed on here, especially as you look kind of down that Eureka corridor. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sites that were proposed by the working group to be removed. You can see those sites listed on the slide here, but specifically the big concerned area in this on the west side was the high density of 35 units to the acre proposed at the Christmas Tree Farm down south of Richfield Community Church. The working group was recommending here a reduction on that site of about 70% of the units that were proposed there. So instead of being 35 units to the acre, that site would change to a 10 unit to the acre site, which again is limited to 2 stories in height. And so that's a 70% reduction for that site. And overall on the west side, with all of those changes, you're looking at about a 35% reduction of what was previously proposed on the west side to what the working group is recommending here. So let's jump to the next slide. And I think that wraps up my portion. Oh, this is just a table that sort of illustrates when you look at the west side versus the central versus the east side of the city. You can see when we total everything up, there's about an equal balance on the west side versus the east side, and certainly the central portion has some units that are proposed there, but that was one of the big concerns with the working group, was having sort of a balance between the west side of the city and the east side of the city. And so let's jump to the next slide. And that wraps up my portion. I think I'm tossing this over to you, Ryder.
I think you are, Nate. Thank you. Actually, go back one slide real quick. I just want to make a quick point. Some eagle-eyed observers may be wondering how the numbers at the bottom of the slide do not sum up to 2,415 units we keep talking about. And the answer is this is only demonstrating the net change in zoning allocation to try to get to units on east-west versus central. There's additional units that are being accounted for in the overall plan, such as accessory dwelling units, ADUs, that are also being counted towards that net 2415 number. And all these details, to be clear, are outlined in the report document that was produced that's available at ylocalcontrol.com. And I know we just threw a ton of numbers at you all. So the other thing to know is literally as we talk right now, if you go to ylocalcontrol.com and then on the top menu bar, you click on community engagement workshops. In the workshops that are listed there, this PowerPoint deck is ready for you to download in PDF format, and you can review it to your heart's content and even preview the slides you're going to be seeing, although at this point, there's only a couple left. I've also already seen a couple questions stream in asking about recording for this. Yes, this is being recorded. Yes, it will be posted to that exact same webpage I just referenced, and it should be available probably by tomorrow to be up on the website. And we urge you to share it with people in your neighborhood and the community in general, so that everybody gets a chance to start gathering up some of this important information. So we will be making everything available and want people to know what's up, particularly as we head into our 3 in-person workshops we have later. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. So to that point, this is only the beginning of public engagement. It's not the end. We have a long road ahead of us before we finally submit theoretically in November with this plan. So all of the effort we're doing right now is all geared around fulfilling the objectives and ideas of the city council and the working group that we need to rigorously engage the community on this program, give you, the members of the public, an opportunity to hear all the complex issues and understand the nuances of housing policy in California, so that you fully have all the details to make some thoughtful decisions. Because ultimately, the outcome of all this, should it move forward to a ballot measure, meaning yes, we advance a housing element, and yes, the city council seeks to implement it, and there will be zoning changes, it will be subject to Measure B, and it will receive. It would be subject to the vote of you, the community members of Yorba Linda. Next slide. So as I noted, there are 4 phases, and I say they're potential because it's not a fait accompli about what happens at phase 4 or phase 3 for that matter. Right now, we're sitting in phase 2. Phase 1 was our working group that we gathered up. Phase 2 is the feedback, the information we're providing tonight, the 3 upcoming workshops and coffee sessions, and the website we have, and the emails you can submit to us with ideas and feedback on the plan. That is all happening now and will be happening through October. And then come November through July, we'll be advancing the housing element, hopefully to a vote through the commission and ultimately direction from the city council to submit the plan to HCD. So the Housing and Community Development Department up in Sacramento can review the plan and make a determination that it is compliant with their guidelines, and it can be certified. In this case, it'll again be conditionally certified because it will require a vote of the residents. And then assuming that that comes back and is conditionally certified and ready to move forward, and we don't have to go through an iteration, although we may have to make some amendments to it, depending upon what HCD says, we'll then move to what we kind of call the phase 4, which is council gives direction, and we know we have to implement zoning changes, and those zoning changes are going to require ballot measure. So between July of 2024 and November of 2024, there'll be additional information made available to the public to ensure voters are fully informed about the choice they get to make. And this will be then present on a ballot in November of 2024, which will be the last opportunity the public will have to vote on this matter before we would, for all intents and purposes, lose our certification of the housing element. All right, next slide. So here's just the rough general timeline that we have going on. I just kind of covered this in detail, so I'm not going to regurgitate this too much because I want to move on to these excellent questions I see streaming in. So